Hello everyone. Today I am going to talk about API discovery in healthcare, why this is matter. I am Anubha Gaur, leading the DevSecOps and API management in Quest Diagnostic. I am API evangelist because I am passionate about APIs and microservices. They are becoming the digital value chain in this digital transformation. I love to travel, and if time permits, then I go for biking. You can find me Twitter, Medium, or the LinkedIn. I want to talk about Quest Diagnostic, that we are the leader in diagnostic testing, insight, and services. The interesting fact is that diagnostic testing accounts 2 to 3% of healthcare spending, but 70% healthcare decisions are based on the testing results. We are serving roughly 50% of US hospitals and physicians. And you can imagine the services and the scale that we provide is that we are serving 1/3 of US adult populations annually, and then roughly 50% populations across the 3 years. We are in 26 regional and esoteric labs, and we provide the value to our partners and then clients. In 2022, we guided 9.8 billion revenues. Out of that, 1.5 is roughly around the COVID-19 testing, and 8.6 is roughly around for the base revenue. These are the interesting facts to understand why API discovery matters in healthcare. So I will be talking about APIs are transforming healthcare, API value chain, why API discovery matters and what it is. I will talk about the 4 foundation building block that we used in Quest Diagnostic to implement API discovery. Then we'll sum it up with the key takeaways. And finally, we will end up with the question and answer. Sounds like a plan. Good. So I want to share Maria's story. Maria is a mother of 2 kids, very focused on family health, looks online to support the family well-beings. She is testing her 10-year-old daughter for allergies, and she schedules an appointment. She takes her daughter to Quest Lab, and she checks in there. She waits. Nurse came, and then nurse it collect the blood, prepare the specimen for the testing. Michael, who is in Quest Diagnostic, part of the logistic team, he collects the specimen from the Quest lab, and then he delivers for the lab testing on the Quest lab. Testing performed is done. Maria receives her daughter test results through email and SMS. She wants to monitor her daughter test results, and based on the results, she wants to take some action. This is a typical experience, integrated experience that Maria, as a mother, she wants to care about her daughter well-being, and she schedule an appointment and she receives the results, and based on the results, she'll take some actions. Behind the scene, all interactions were talked to each other through API. APIs are APIs are exposing these business functions through the interface. And this is how they are integrating and improving the customer experience. And eventually, it helps to drive the business growth. API means application programming interface. So I would highly recommend to read these books. One is the Continuous API Management. Another one is the API management by Burjesh Day. Both the books talks about that how API is driving the business growth. According to the IDC report in the book, they mentioned that API focused organization, they are up to 30% revenue generated by digital channel. So it's important to understand that its API is a way to connect business units together and provide these capabilities to the third-party partners, to the third-party consumers to solve the business problem. One interesting thing that in the continuous API management, they talk about that our focus should be on API consumer instead of API producer or publisher. And that is where the whole mindset of how to easily discover those APIs, that is the important concept. It comes into the picture because it is driving the new distribution channel, and that's come through the API value chain. So the next question is, then what is the API value chain and how it is start and how it is delivering the value? So API value chain start with the assets on the right hand side. Assets, business services, business capabilities. That is the organizations wants to allow others to use. And start with the assets. So as an example that I talk about Maria, that she wants to make an appointment. Internally, that in Quest, we develop the lab testing appointment scheduler. That is one of the service. So the API provider team, which is the API designer, when they're designing the API, they look at who is the target audience. Yes, the one target audience is our Quest customers. Other ones is the third-party partners. So how to unlock the value, that is how API providers wants to design the APIs. And that's where API developer on the left-hand side, which they are the consumers. They are going to use the APIs. They discover the API and design this the application or the solution to solve the business problem for the patients. And end users nowadays, they use the large number of the different connected devices. So one of the challenge in API adoptions comes when it's the lack of expertise in how we are managing and supporting the APIs when they are at the large scale. And that's where the question comes up. How to easily discover the API? But the fundamental thing is, what is API discovery means is. So API discovery is the ability of finding and creating inventory for the APIs. This is the way to find what is the sensitive health data this API can access. This is the easy way to understand what is the API performance is, and if new features is added in the API as a product. And the whole value comes in when we are thinking about that how API is fit into the overall API lifecycle management and API governance. So the more APIs that we are creating, that is where the unexpected behavior comes into the picture. So I want to share a classic problem at the enterprise level. Enterprise level, we have multiple business units. One team is focusing and developing their own APIs. Team Red, Team Blue is another one who is focusing another set of the APIs. You can take as an example in CVS, Walgreen, or Quest, right? That locations, whether CVS has a multiple services, multiple business unit, Minute Clinic, pharmacy, the other one is the hub and the retail. So the multiple business units, they have their own teams and they are developing the APIs, location API. That's where the challenge comes, that because these API, the teams, they are developing the same set of the capabilities in the duplications, and unexpected behavior comes. So this is a typical API scaling problem when lack of API standard, excuse me, when the lack of API standards, because there is no API governance and there is no single API inventory, and that is driving the high build and maintenance cost. I am sure you must have heard this problem or you have seen this problem in the enterprise level. So, important to understand the API governance is the heart of the overall API lifecycle management. This is the interesting quote that I want to share with you. It is in the continuous API management book that, hey, rule is a rule, let's face it. Without rule, there is a chaos. Cosmas Kramer. So the API governance start from the every steps of the life cycle. When the API product, why this is needed, what is the usage, what is the business value is going to drive, these are the important questions should be addressed before we design an API. But before we design an API, understand what if this API discovery, do the discovery, what if it is already available internally. Same example, location API, what if it's already available? And then design the API with all the right API standard, doing the proper API documentation as a part of the designing part. Apply the good practices during the development time. And then once is the development, is that all those CI/CD, the good development practices that applying, and then do the the testing, mock testing, integration testing, pen testing. They are all part of the governance. And before we deploy the API from QA to stage to the production, following those deployment practices as a standard, enterprise standard. And then look at that, if that API is secure, it is the throttling, this is the throttling, and then the spike arrest. All the policies are there, the OAuth, API OAuth, API key, all that, put it in the API secure, put it some standard around it. And before publishing the API, look at that, configure the API properly, the monitoring, the measurement, setup, and publish on API portal. This is a typical API lifecycle management. And that's where the API governance is the center. Every steps we have to put together the governance practices around the APIs. Before I talk about the 4 fundamental building blocks that we used in during this this implementation time, I want to touch base on what is private, public, and partner APIs, and what is FHIR APIs. There is a good source, as you can see, you can read on HL7 site. Good informations available on Google Cloud. That's I've already shared the links. And there is a good video I've been added that they talk about the fundamentals on what is the private, public, and partner, and then which one and why they are internal and external. So private API, same example that in Quest, we are developing the lab locations, scheduler appointment. Those are the APIs were developed only for my Quest application. That is the private API which is developed for the organization, for the employee. They could be internal, but here in this case, it was external also because it was outside the firewall. But what if this appointment scheduler API, our partners like hospital or the universities or the airlines are interested to use this appointment scheduler API, that will become the partner API. because it is available only for partners with the contractual agreement and restrictions will apply. Public API is available to the public. These are easy to use. Classic example, weather API, that it's, I think, weatherbit.com. They provide the public API. This is external purpose and easy to consume. The top of this, when we are working on healthcare APIs, the FHIR API, this is the healthcare data standard that is sit on top of EHR, electronic healthcare records. So FHIR is an information network that lets us to connect the data across the system. And that is a RESTful API, and the data represent into the JSON format. Now I want to touch base on what is the implementation approach that we used in Quest for API discovery. The first step that we implemented during our API program is the API governance. That is the first step that we implemented, because API governance is the important part for a successful API program. It improves our API developer experience. As I mentioned, that we should focus about the API consumers, because they are going to use it. Should be easy to use, easy to consume, secure, and easy to discover. And that is the first step that we implemented. The second thing that we put in good practices around the API documentations, because it improves the API insights. This is the first interface when developer interact with the API, because that's how they learn about what this API does. And then once this documentation practices were established, that the next step that we implemented is build the single source of truth. Means API developer portal, where developers can find their APIs. That is a place where we can onboard them with the right way. And at the same time, we were making sure that API documentation should be up to date. And then finally, as we were building the single source of truth for the internal APIs, as I said, private APIs or the partner APIs, all that in one place, we were categorizing them by their type, by the portfolio, because it was easy to follow. So we built the API inventory, and then it helps to improve our API consumption model. So at the end, I will talk about overall thing that if you can see that API, if you see the Maria story, right, how her experience is changing. So API is transforming healthcare customer experience. They are the connecting tissue in the digital value chain. One thing we want to understand that API consumer or API developer are the center. And when we are designing the API, we have to understand it should be easy to consume, easy to understand, and easy to discover, and it should be secure. So API discovery is the element of lifecycle management and governance. And FHIR APIs, that is the layer on top of the EHR that allows our application to interact with its data. And finally, this is very important, that developer experience is the key of successful API adoption, and that drives how easy they can discover the healthcare API. Thank you very much.